There's a lot of argument or disagreement among all of us nerds over what DMARC is really meant to do. Because they say authentication, anybody can authenticate, a bad guy can authenticate, right? A bad guy can set up DKIM, he can publish a DMARC record. That alone is not going to be enough to prove that that's a good guy versus a bad guy. But all of these things, DMARC and DKIM in particular, does one thing well, and that's connects a message to a domain, and you can apply a reputation to that domain. And if that domain is being seen doing bad things, whether that be spear phishing, spamming, or whatever, you have the opportunity to identify, to fingerprint, and block based on that.
Hi, Al. It's great to have you on the podcast today. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you about the life of Al Iverson and Spam Resource, one of the best blogs on email deliverability on the planet. So I wanted to start by asking you about Al Iverson. What was your journey that got you into the world of email deliverability? And ultimately, what led you to create your blog that is read by so many people who have to deliver email for a living?
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for having me here. I appreciate it. How did I get started? I've been really lucky. And my success certainly has been significantly a product of that luck, of being in the right place at the right time and somebody giving me a chance to try something. This is my fourth or fifth career, to be honest, from some, some sort of glamorous things to sort of some less glamorous things, working my way up from, working in restaurants to being a typesetter, doing, working for a forms company, working my way up into doing graphics work, design, and retouching, and pre-press, print preparation work for advertising in the mid to late 90s. That was my first sort of success with a career, was doing a lot of press work for print ads for advertisers you absolutely would have heard of. And then at that same time, that company was just getting on the internet. And I helped them set up their first internet server. And so we set up the first email service to have it go along with our Service Bureau services. And it started to get spam. And so this is 1997 probably, and they needed help figuring out what to do about that. And it was very much a Wild West at the time. If you were starting to get spam, it was some pretty gross and disgusting stuff. There was stuff I don't necessarily even want to joke about on a recording in my own voice that'll come back to haunt me later. So we're building filters to block this stuff. And I started to share those filters with other people, turned that into another job, working for the Mail Abuse Prevention System, the company that created the first block list, the real-time black hole list, and realized that was no fun because you just are getting yelled at by all sides. The marketers are mad that you're trying to interfere in their business, and the other people who are getting spam are mad that you're not blocking spam fast enough for them. So it felt like there's really no way to please anybody there. And so figured out, well, what could I do with this knowledge and actually turn that into something? And that led me to going to an e-commerce provider in Minnesota, where I was living at the time. They had a little mini email platform based on listserv and some stuff built on top of that where they were doing email marketing. They had run afoul of maps and a few other block list issues, and were trying to figure out the right way to handle those kind of issues. And so they sort of hired me to be an internal spam policeman. So that was in October of 2000. That was before anybody had coined the term deliverability. My first title there was Consumer Privacy Manager. And my goal was to guide primarily software companies that used the e-commerce provider to sell downloadable software to remarket to their customers and be able to sell upgrades and more stuff to those customers. And so I ended up managing a marketing operations team that was doing a little bit of everything. Because at that point, deliverability at that company anyway wasn't enough to be a full-time job. So there's a little bit of dealing with your AOL whitelisting and complaints and that sort of stuff back in the early aughts. But also, just doing other random marketing stuff from facilitating paid search and helping third-party tracking, conversion tracking, that sort of stuff. But then the email stuff just sort of kept growing and growing, and I sort of turned that into a career, and I've been doing sort of deliverability-related stuff ever since then.
That, when you were talking about your work for Maps, I was thinking, oh, that must have been in the early aughts. But no, that was in the 1990s. So you were dealing with spam before spam was a thing for most people.
Yeah, I think, I actually sent my first marketing email too in 1998, in late 1998, when I helped my friend set up a website for his jazz club. And we were just trying to figure out what are other ways we could sort of market to people. And with my sort of spam fighting background, we set up, double opt-in email capture and set up the little website, started pushing people to the website with the goal of what can we do with this? And, we built it to more than 5,000 subscribers, and it ended up replacing the paper mailing list, saved the club a bunch of money. And it was fun because the way that we weren't really sure how to measure the reach, unintentionally figured out how, by all I had to do was typo something in a way that would impact the cover charge for tonight at the club. And then, so if I got it wrong and it was off by, $5 or $10 and cheaper in the email, people would print out the email or bring it with and say, but the email says, so that was our proof that that email was actually working.
An accidental investment into market research. So, a long time ago, when we both got into the world of email, mailboxes were scattered across a really wide array of receiver platforms. I mean, a lot of companies, if not most companies, ran their own mail server. Universities ran their own mail servers, and running a mail server was a thing. So in deliverability, if you were having trouble reaching the inbox, it was a different thing per domain, really, because there was such a disparate way that email was being handled. Today, it's totally different. Microsoft and Google are really the dominant email receivers, and it's where the vast majority of inboxes are. How has the concentration of email receivers changed the world of deliverability during your career?
So specifically for B2C, that's really where the most concentration has taken place, where with top 8 providers is 95% of the reach of a US B2C email list. Anything you've got, like you said, you've got, what we call Maggie, Microsoft, now Apple, used to be AOL, Microsoft, Apple, Gmail, Yahoo, maybe Comcast, maybe a couple more, but then you get below that and everybody's below 1%, way below 1% of a common list, and probably skewing older because it's newer people are signing up for Gmail. Yahoo's actually growing, niche services like Proton Mail, stuff like that. There's a lot of complaining about that. A lot of people are going, "Oh my God, Gmail controls the world." And I think people should take it with a grain of salt because it's not actually hard to deliver mail to Gmail. What it is easy to do is it's easy to configure things wrong sometimes, and it's tough to keep up with the evolution of security requirements, system requirements, and that's not that unique to just email, right? Everything on the internet is a lot more complicated now than it was 25 years ago, and you can't just stand up a server and not have a firewall like you might have done and turned on Telnet like you might have done in the late 90s and have everything be fine. The same thing's true with email. It's very easy to set up an email server and be able to send an email. I just to kind of prove that I could do it, not earlier this year, a number of months ago, I set up, a mail in a box, which is, webmail, postfix, Dovecot, a bunch of other stuff that I ran it in Google Cloud. Google Cloud blocks port 25, and so I relay it out through another VPS I have at a different service where it's not blocked. And it's still not that hard. Just build up the reputation and make sure everything's authenticated and don't send weird stuff. And thankfully, there's a bunch of people who just love to jump up and down and yell and scream and stick their fingers in their ears and say, Gmail can't tell me what to do. Google and Microsoft can't tell me what to do. I'm not going to bow down to them, and so they don't get their mail delivered. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the loudest people online, blogging otherwise, complaining about the concentration of mail providers are just people who have for whatever reason, in some cases they don't want to keep up with best practices or whatever. But it's possible, it's doable. Now B2B is a lot more fun in a different way, right? Because there's still that concentration, but it's a bigger world. You look at you guys, for example. I can take the top 10 million domains. There's a bunch of places that'll rank them sort of by traffic or, web traffic, for example. Take that and just add the MX record to all those domains and do a grep an account through there to see how many of those are hosted by mail channels or somebody else. And you can see that there are a ton of B2B providers. A lot of them will host, 25,000 plus domains, 25 to 35,000 plus domains in that top 10 million. So that's still a lot of providers. It's still smaller than the old days when everybody set up their own postfix or exchange or send mail install. But there's still a lot of different places you have to deal with out there. So for me, it hasn't changed that much. It's always a case of continuing to evolve, and for Gmail being the top sort of provider by percentage of lists on either B2C or B2B, I'm mostly happy with it because I'm a content user and I'm a content consultant in that I don't find their requirements are too arduous, and occasionally they have glitches and things go silly, and I certainly wish they talk to people a little more openly. But for the most part, they're doing things that I love to see, like the new upcoming sender requirements for 2024. Those are fantastic. Those are closing loopholes. Those are sort of codifying best practices into actual written guidance, written rules, and I love that because it helps improve the email ecosystem. I think the email ecosystem is still vibrant, and there's still if email's not dead, it's not going anywhere. So I'm happy with it.
Yeah, let's actually go there. So Google announced a little while ago this year that in early 2024, they were going to unleash a bunch of new requirements onto email senders, such as making sure that your domain is using domain authentication techniques like DMARC. They're being pretty open about what the complaint rate needs to be if you want to send more than 5,000 messages, to Gmail users. Talk about how or why is this a good thing for email generally, and what's the sort of consequences of these changes that Google is bringing about in the new year?
So Gmail, it helps to understand the history of spam filtering at Gmail a little bit. And for the longest time, they took a little bit of a different path than a lot of other people. A lot of us old timers that have been around for a while, it was, we did a lot of blocking. We did a lot of blocking based on IP addresses, a little bit based on domain, but a lot of what we did was all rejecting at the gateway. Gmail took a different path. They were the least likely to block mail, though they still ran it through checks. They still applied algorithms. They still applied best practices. But a lot of the times, if you violated those best practices or you were not authenticating properly or whatever, you would still get delivered. You would just get delivered to the spam folder. So Gmail is very hesitant to outright reject mail for whatever reasons. You can only guess. They would probably have issues with scale, and pushing the address book to the edge can be a big and scary thing sometimes. But at the end of the day, they didn't block a lot of mail. They have slowly perhaps wised up to the fact that is an exploitable thing. I have occasionally run into spammers in the old days who would say, we're so happy that we're getting our mail through to Gmail. We don't care if it goes to the spam folder, because there are people dumb enough who go in there and dig it out and buy, counterfeit products, which is crazy. And so Gmail has very slowly begun to block. They have started to apply rules where they weren't doing it before. Now, we're kind of hit a thing where they've added a rule every so often, maybe a rule a month or a couple rules a month, where if you're violating RFCs with extra headers you're not supposed to have, if you were previously authenticating mail and then stopped, if your domain reputation is just so low that they think the mail is going to be unwanted, if your IP reputation is just so low, all of these things now are reasons that they are starting to block mail, that they're rejecting it. They're not even letting it through the edge. And so that that makes me so happy, because what it does is it is a more active pushback for bad guys to know that they are not welcome in this environment, and an active feedback to people who are mean well but are erring, who
Right.
need better feedback to know that what they're doing is not working properly. And from my perspective, rejecting that mail is much more useful than silently spam filtering it. So I'm happy to see this. And this The changes are mostly they're evolutionary, not revolutionary. They're incremental. It's stuff that people have known as best practices for a long time. Authentication, implement a DMARC record, keep your complaint rates low. That's another one right there. Gmail has never blocked mail before because of a high complaint rate. This is all quite new to them. They occasionally, the worst of the worst senders in the past couple of years would see blocks, but they were still relatively rare. So it's great to see all this stuff sort of gel.
So do you think that the fact that Google, the dominant receiver, is starting to enforce essentially best sender practices, right? Things like authentication, making sure that you deliver mail that people want so that your complaint rate is low. The fact that they're now blocking on that basis, it's going to lead to lower amounts of abuse because the bad guys aren't going to be able to get anything through. Whereas people who are trying to do the right thing will have a better shot. It'll kind of like pre-filter email traffic, make it easier to distinguish between what is good and what is bad. It's sort of easier to be a good guy and harder to be a bad guy. Is it fair to say that?
Absolutely. And there will be people screaming about it. But a lot of those are really the edge cases, or it's something where there's a simple fix, and there's say that we've never sent a piece of spam in our entire lives, but they might not even know that they have a sales department that's buying lists and sending to them, right? So there will be a few people around the edges saying otherwise, saying that it's unfair, it's unprecedented. But even those cries are not new, right? But there's a whole history there for those of us that have been around the block a couple of times. The stuff like DearAOL.com was the website that the EFF and others put together when they said that AOL was unfairly blocking email, unfairly blocking mail as spam, and their best efforts to block spam. It made a lot of noise, made a splash, but in the end of the day, people that wanted to be able to send email could.
Right. So and perhaps these changes that are being made are going to make that even easier in a way. I've never been an email marketer. Mail channels we've always thought of ourselves as working more on the security side to prevent bad stuff from going out the door. And to the extent that we run a large email delivery service, our goal with that service is to try to fix the best practice problems of the senders who are sending through our platform, most of whom are very tiny small businesses or individuals who have no idea about how to do things right. So we try to filter out for them. We try to give them a signal of what's not going to work so that they can fix their practices and start getting mail delivered. I view these changes from Google as being very positive for what we do, because it'll make it a whole lot easier for us to reject stuff before even trying to send it in the first place. Like if we know something is destined for Google and it doesn't adhere to their standards, we can just block it at our edge and it'll never even be tried. So to what extent do you see these changes actually having a beneficial impact on email sending services and allowing them to be more selective about their customers?
Where Google leads, others are forced to follow, whether they like it or not. For me, the parallel there is if you think about in the U.S., California automotive standards for safety, for smog emissions, and for all of that kind of stuff. California is big enough that on its own, as a country, it would be one of the biggest in the world still. So that's a market that automobile manufacturers have to comply with. And the net there is that in most cases, they don't want to make two different cars, one for California and one for outside of California. So they make one car that complies with California, but also has the side effect of bringing those higher compliance limits that California has to the rest of the United States. And to me, there's a great parallel there with Gmail, that nobody's going to want to have to think about, how do I treat this message differently as a sender when it's going to Gmail versus going to Microsoft or Yahoo or Apple or anybody else.
Right.
If I follow all of the best practices and just make sure I comply with all of it, then it's going to go everywhere just fine, and I don't have to discern at that one level. You can have one level, one set of standards, and not have to have an individual per domain standard. That to me, that's the real key there is, Gmail really is sort of leading the industry in that positive way. Yahoo is a big part of that too. I don't want to discount them. Marcel Becker will send me an angry email if he sees that I don't mention Yahoo here. And it's very important to them
Right.
to make it so that it's not worth the effort of, if the big guys all require best practices, that only leaves you little targets to send the bad stuff to. And at some point, it's a diminishing return.
So a lot of senders are really small. I mean, if I think about the senders who use mail channels, many of them don't even know mail channels exists. They're just using a hosting service. They're using a WordPress plugin to send mail to a small mailing list or to send receipts out of an e-commerce system. They may have no idea how to comply with these new standards. What do you think are the ways in which senders are most likely to fall down when these new standards roll out in early 2024?
It is very easy for some small businesses to sort of fall through the cracks there because, even though we look at it as email industry people and say, oh, this is easy to implement, somebody like you say who is just a sub customer of a reseller that's using mail channels, or maybe they're sending their bookstore newsletter through Constant Contact or MailChimp or ConvertKit or any one of those marketing platforms. And the challenge there is how do you diffuse that knowledge out to all of those small businesses, many of whom their expertise, is going to be the focus of the business, not technology, right? A bookseller's expertise is in selling books, not implementing a DMARC record. And so the challenge there for us and everybody involved is that any sending platform that touches that customer or sub-customer has to be very proactive to try to share that knowledge and hopefully nudge that customer in the right direction. Some of these things the platform can do sort of, transparently or sort of silently, stuff like, the easy unsubscribe and the list unsubscribe post requirements. Those are really more ESP or CRM tool requirements. Certainly nobody's expecting a small business to have to implement that as a standalone on their own. Those plugins or commerce tools or links to SendGrid, or whatever they're doing, those tools might need upgrading to support that, but nobody's expecting somebody to build it themselves when they're a small business. And so, that does leave a bit of a challenge there of education. Education's going to be key, and there's still going to be a few stub toes the first time those blocks drop into place. And I hope people understand that that's the nature of the evolution of security, right? You can notify, but at some point you've actually got to start sanctioning stuff that doesn't comply, and that's regardless of the reason why it doesn't comply. And with the understanding also that the fixes for that sort of non-compliance are generally going to be easy. Like if you go, why is Gmail bouncing my mail? It's because of a lack of a DMARC record. You're going to have a very explicit error message that says this domain does not have DMARC implemented properly. And that's a guiding star right there. And you might have to work with your service provider to say, okay, where do I go from here? Some of them might recommend you just put in a very simple, for example, DMARC P equals none text record.
Yeah.
Some might recommend that you go work with one of the DMARC consulting providers. Some might have a tool to sort of do that in-house for you. A lot of ways to skin that, but people have got to figure out how to notice it. And hopefully people will learn it more from that upfront education. And then the people that don't, they'll see it in the bounces.
So one thing you wrote about in your blog recently that also pertains to Google is that Google is starting in December 2023 to retire old accounts in a more significant way than they have in the past. And this is generating bounces. How is that affecting email senders, all these new bounces from Google?
So historically, going all the way back to the AOL days of the early aughts, a high bounce rate was an indication that you were a bad sender. So if you had a higher bounce rate than everybody else, and AOL is stack ranking those results to look at the percentages and large amounts of mail being sent, high bounce rate probably put you on a path to deliverability death. But nowadays it's a little more subtle, where most ISPs are not more specifically looking at number of bounces, for example, but it can still matter, and it's still an indicator that ties into some dashboards, including Google's own Google Postmaster tools, Microsoft SNDS, and other tools like that. They are still looking at and calculating attempts to send mail that are going nowhere. They're being rejected because the other end of the connection, there's nobody there. The inbox is gone. The mailbox is gone. So from that perspective, the important thing there, it's not so much that you have to freak out and go, oh my God, I had an 8% bounce rate today where I only had a 3% previously. That's okay. That's expected. These changes are coming. There has to bounce sometime. It's never bounced before. But the magic the magic solution really is just going to be making sure you're identifying them properly, suppressing them, and not mailing to them anymore. Some marketers have been sort of cheekily saying, well, what are you doing emailing somebody who hasn't responded in 2 years? And yeah, best practices, you would hope that they're trying to get some sign of life out of subscribers. There's this whole concept of a subscriber lifecycle management process where if somebody is showing no sign of life and you're sending to them as a marketer, at some point you might want to drop them into a series of attempts to get their attention, what marketers might call a win-back campaign. Give it 1 or 2 or 3 attempts to get a click or some sort of sign of life from them. And if not, they're gone. Throw it out. There's nobody home there. But with Apple's mail privacy protection coming on the scene a couple years ago, Apple's MPP sort of changed the game with regard to the ability to accurately filter out unengaged, nobody home subscribers. There's a lot of false positive noise in open tracking, for example. It was already imperfect, but now it's way imperfect. And so you cannot really trust it on a per individual basis to denote whether or not somebody's home. So even a good sender, a good marketing sender is going to have a fair number of Gmail subscribers that are now going to bounce that were not bouncing before. Even if they're all double opt-in and if they're doing everything right otherwise, or non-marketing senders, or people that run discussion groups, they're still out there, and there's still a lot of them. They send a lot of mail. They don't necessarily track engagement in that same way. And so mail's going to start to bounce now that wasn't bouncing before. So I look at it like, honestly, the reason that I blogged about it is because I wanted people to understand that it's not something to freak out about. It's an expected course of doing business kind of thing. Addresses get retired. Other ISPs used to do it more often, do it more often. Yahoo does it periodically. Microsoft probably does as well. But now that Gmail's the biggest place and they're doing this, it's going to have a noticeable impact. But it's expected, and it shouldn't be worried. You shouldn't worry that it's the end of the world, because it's not.
In a way, it's actually helpful, right? Because at least you're getting a definitive signal that you can act on to remove these addresses from your list. You know they're dead. If they bounced from Gmail with a 500, they're gone.
Exactly.
Well, at least you think they're gone. I mean, sometimes we know that even the largest providers make mistakes and send back 500 errors when it should have been a 400 or whatever. And like that does happen. You got to be a little bit careful. But broadly speaking, it sounds like it's going to be helpful, actually.
Yeah, and in a lot of those cases too, if you really just let the provider deal with the bounce handling, if you're a marketing sender and you're using MailChimp or Salesforce Marketing Cloud or whatever, those systems have methodology for tracking that and ways to reset that if something goes wrong. And some of those places, like where I used to work, we had a counter-based bounce system. So it would have to, one 5XX bounce would not be enough to knock off the list, but a few of them would. So that gives a little bit of wiggle room, because like you say, we've all been there where our good friend at Yahoo will say, we had an oops yesterday.
So since March of this year, maybe actually since November of 2022, AI has all of a sudden been in everyone's life. And especially since the launch of GPT-4, I feel like it was a wow moment in the history of technology. And I have not been able to stop looking at the generative AI space since that time. I now see, personally, a whole lot more cold prospecting type email coming into my inbox. I bet a lot of it is generated by GPT and other generative AI language models. How do you see it taking a spot in the world of email marketing and email sending generally? What are some of the problems that will start to emerge because of generative AI? And how do you think marketers should think about this? How do you think receivers should think about this? What's your take on generative AI in the world of email?
So like you, unfortunately, my primary experience with it has been by receiving many more cold lead emails than I had received in the past. And yeah, like you say, they tend to read as if they've been AI generated. And to me, it seems like a whole bunch of sloppy marketers just found a source for discount lunch meat, and they're really just pushing it as fast and hard as they can. So you get this lower quality stuff coming out that they wouldn't otherwise have sent before. So before it would have been none. Now they've got access to this lower quality words that they weren't putting out before. And so that's what they're sending. I think they haven't realized success from that yet, though. And I think there's a whole bunch of people jumping on the AI bandwagon without them knowing or understanding or having any idea where that bandwagon is going. So I think we're going to see what I hope is a temporary explosion of misuse of AI generated cold lead emails, for example. I don't think they're going to drive that great much more engagement than cold emails would before, because the craftiness of the message was never the only driver for engagement, was never the only reason that I would want to read your email. It's about what you're selling, what your brand is, what our connection is. Did I want this? Do I want this? And so AI does not substitute for any of that. And so from that perspective, it is annoying, but a little bit harmless. And I think people will realize that they're sort of wasting money on doing it. And it ties back to the overall ongoing problems of cold lead emails, where people tell me every week somebody tries to tell me how great cold leads are, and they have to do them. They need them to keep the business engine running. That's great. If they're so fantastic, why are they all going to the spam folder? Right there, every ISP mechanism that's designed to measure interactivity, whether or not messages are wanted, whether or not messages are interacted with, it's failing all those tests. The messages are not wanted, and the robot rewriting the text of the body for them certainly isn't going to fix that. So from my perspective, it's a little bit of same as it ever was.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this issue a lot. In the summer, I used the ChatGPT API and the Gmail API, and I built a cold prospecting mail detector. I trained it in context with some examples, and basically it just runs on a cron job on my Mac. Every so often, it downloads my inbox. It looks for messages from people I've never communicated with before, and it just basically asks the model, does this look like a cold prospecting email? And it's shockingly good at spotting the cold prospecting messages, which it then applies a label to so that I can see them in my inbox. And then it greatly lessens the amount of effort that I have to put into filtering through my mail. Because, a lot of these messages are not going to the spam folder. They are just crafty enough, just unique enough that they're making it all the way through. And the accounts they're coming from, I'm noticing, are increasingly Gmail accounts or Outlook.com accounts. They're not personal domains. And I just kind of wonder if, these changes that Google and Yahoo are making to, domain authentication, to requiring a low complaint rate, are going to drive some of this gray area marketing activity over into the major free mail domains. Then it becomes an issue of them trying to police their own traffic in the outbound direction.
Well, first off, that's awesome. It sounds really cool that you built an engine to be able to catch that. And let's take that to the nth degree. Gmail is applying AI to try to make their spam filters better, right? And so in that same way,
sure,
the arms race is ongoing. And that is definitely a challenge, to your point about trying to send cold prospecting mail from individual Gmail or Outlook addresses, or G Suite or O365. In either case, what they're trying to do is leverage that domain or IP reputation of the broader Google or broader Microsoft platform, and that is a gap that has not been well addressed as of yet. One assumes that they'll have to get better over time, because if it grows in abuse, the level of annoyance is going to grow. And if people are going to get so mad that every time they get an email from somebody at Gmail, it tends to be a cold lead spam, they're not going to accept emails from Gmail anymore. So there certainly is a class of boring little bad guys trying to exploit this little gray middle ground I spun up a new account. I just sent a few messages. It's not enough for anybody to sort of fingerprint me yet. So I got through this time. The good thing is that eventually the algorithm catches up. But that's where that gray area is, how many messages can you get away with until it catches up with you? And I'm hopeful that it gets better, but yeah, that is an annoyance.
Yeah, I'm also hopeful. Frankly, really hopeful that the changes being introduced by Google and Yahoo are going to make cold prospecting harder. In my opinion, and I've had these companies try to sell us services, and we've never used them because they claim that there's nothing illegal about this, there's nothing wrong with it, and I look at the legislation, I'm like, it is actually illegal. In a lot of places, it's illegal. You can't just send someone a message because you found their email address somewhere and never had a business relationship with them. It's literally against the law in Canada, for example. And I just wonder, what is the longevity of these firms offering cold prospecting as a service? Never mind AI-based cold prospecting. Are we going to see these companies sunset in the next year or two because of the changes being introduced by Google and Yahoo that are tightening up sender requirements?
A funny story. I can think back to 10, 15 years ago now, where I ran into another person who works in email at a bar here in Chicago, and he's working on a little email platform and struggling with spam and other issues. And then I run into him a few years later. He's moved on to a different company. He's doing some different thing. And then a few years later, he's built a cold leads engine. He's using the Gmail API to be able to try to trick as much mail through before domain reputation catches up with his customers. And he actually posted on some social media that he got a sort of a snotty cease and desist notice from Google. Like, you're misusing your API. This is not what it's made for. That and some of the other noise that I've heard from people at Google or around the edges of the ecosystem make it clear that Google doesn't really want their tools to be used for this way. And just because you can exploit that loophole today doesn't mean you have a long-term business ahead of you. Like I said, this guy, is on business idea number 5, and I would assume the first 4 didn't go so well, or he wouldn't have to keep iterating quite so broadly. But I look at a lot of those where I've been doing email stuff for 25 years, and this guy coming up to me telling me, cold leads are the most awesome thing in the world. He's been doing it for 9 months, and what he's doing is trying to sell other people on him taking their money and shoveling some mail for him, and then he'll disappear. You'll never hear from him again. So I feel very confident that it's not a long-term strategy. And there's also, let's be clear, there's cold leads and there's cold leads, right? Anything is on a spectrum. There's good ways to do stuff and bad ways to do stuff. If somebody's sending, I had somebody try to defend it and tell me they're sending 15 messages a month total. Dude, you are not the cold leads problem. Go nuts with your one-to-one emails. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not looking at the legality of what you're doing, but it's certainly not an ecosystem level problem.
Yeah. Not at that volume. No, I think the issue arises when you're sending, literally thousands of cold messages per day that you've crafted with information from Zoom info and maybe stuff you bought on the dark web. I mean, there's some shady tactics available out there if you want to exploit them. In the generative AI space, one area that we've been looking at a lot at Mail Channels is the impact of generative AI on phishing. We're already starting to see phishing attacks that are definitely customized through generative AI. So rather than just sending out a template, it's more Nigerian scammer type of messages, but they're clearly being written by AI. And you sort of wonder how long it's going to be before the really bad guys start using generative AI, language models, image generation models, etc., to start attacking recipients with phishing, sophisticated spear phishing campaigns. And I wondered if, maybe straying from what you're currently focused on in the deliverability side, but if you have any opinions about what's going to be coming down the pipe for security with generative AI.
I think the key there, I think stuff like DMARC is going to be a big component of trying to apply best practices to mitigate the risk of business email compromise in that context. When you think about what DMARC is meant to do. And a lot of the there's a lot of argument or disagreement among all of us nerds over what DMARC is really meant to do, and what it because they say authentication, anybody can authenticate. A bad guy can authenticate. Right? A bad guy can set up DKIM. He can publish a DMARC record. That alone is not going to be enough to prove that that's a good guy versus a bad guy. But all of these things, DMARC and DKIM in particular, DKIM does one thing well, and that's connects a message to a domain, and you can apply a reputation to that domain. And if that domain is being seen doing bad things, whether that be spear phishing, spamming, or whatever, you have the opportunity to identify, to fingerprint, and block based on that. And what you're doing is you sort of increase that barrier to entry, right? Because if you want to cycle through domains, you've got to purchase them. If somebody's going through a low-cost TLD and buying them by the sack full, eventually they're going to run through those, or that TLD will have a poor reputation, as we have seen sometimes. And so you put all of that together, that you have to sort of raise the barrier of entry, not to the ceiling, but you've got to raise it just a little bit, so that it, if the effort, the cost there is really going to take you, so that you're going to have to spin through domains, you'd have to spin through reputational problems, to spin through domains to get away from reputational problems, that you're not going to have a successful model enough to be able to get the success doing the bad stuff you want to do. It's really a case of all of these things will catch up with them and catch up eventually. I think, I don't know about down where you are, but here in Chicago, we have a problem with catalytic converter theft. And there was just a thing, people talk about, you can't do anything about it. Nothing's, the cops don't do anything. It's happening nonstop. There's one on this block and there's one on the next block. Well, the guy I just saw on the news yesterday, or last week actually, where a guy out in one of the suburbs, the cops went into his garage and he's got 300 catalytic converters in his garage. And so he's going to jail probably for a long time. And I'm sure he thought things were going great right up until number 299, right? Eventually that stuff catches up with him eventually, not as fast as we would want, but it will happen. And so I think the same thought process, to get weird on that, is, the same thought process is you make it harder for guys to be able to do that. And yeah, they'll still do it to some degree, but when it catches up to them, it catches up to them in a bad way that'll hopefully stop it from happening again, or at least make it very hard to repeat.
Well, I certainly hope that your point of view comes to pass for the bad guys. One thing I worry about a lot is bad guys going multimodal. So it used to be that phishing attacks were mostly, and maybe they still are, mostly template-based, mass emails, pouring out of compromised web hosting servers. And there's not a lot of thought put into it. It's just pump the templates out. A small fraction of people are going to reply. What we're seeing in the last couple of years is a shift towards sending attacks out also through SMS. So there will be an SMS message from Netflix telling you that you've got to update your credit card information, or from your bank, very common kind of SMS attack. They seem to be able to create new domains weekly, create very high quality mobile phishing sites. They put up barriers to automated detection by forcing the user to fill in a CAPTCHA, which is, hey, it's something that you have to do with your regular bank. So why wouldn't it be a legitimate thing to do with a phishing site as well? But I wonder how AI is going to enable the bad guys to run these campaigns over multiple channels, email being one of them, but also text and even voice. If you think about some of the more recent voice capabilities that are in these, these language models, I really see that as being a major challenge for the industry, that we don't really have great tools to face off against.
Yeah, especially on the SMS front, right? Because short codes are so opaque to the end user. Like when you legitimately use SMS-based two-factor from 10 different companies, you get codes from 20 different short codes. Like how do you tie a reputation to that as a savvy end user? You can't. So how do the providers do it?
Yeah. Like you have no way of authenticating the sender, right? There's not like an icon that pops up on your iPhone saying this is definitely UPS.
Yeah, for me, it's always like, what are the identifiers outside of the content? Like, what's the meta? What are the meta tags that are associated with that content? And anything that you can identify there reliably, you can attach a reputation to and hopefully track and figure out what's good and what's bad. There's so many gaps in SMS and voice calling. It's so easy to spoof caller ID that, that shake and stir thing was supposed to shut that down, and it doesn't really. I mean, it's sort of, people sort of comply, and every once in a while some VoIP provider gets spanked for doing something silly, but it's not enough. I mean, there's still too much of that going on. That and like you say, smishing, man, if I was a bad guy and that's how I was going to rob people, I think smishing would be the way to do it, because like you say, you connect better with people, and you can get away with more opaque identifiers, for example.
And I know that you and I both know really good people who work at Apple in the anti-abuse side. They will probably never come on my podcast because it's so secretive at Apple. But something emerged recently that is making me very worried on the smishing front, and that is an open source project that lets you send iMessage messages from Python code. And you don't even have to have an Apple device, because Apple has this weak spot where to support older devices, these older devices cannot send a signed attestation that the message is coming from an actual Apple device with a unique serial number. So they have to leave open the possibility for older devices to talk to the network. And anyway, there's Python code you can go onto GitHub and get, and you can send out iMessages that look just like every other iMessage. So I wonder if at some point we might see a blue check mark, on iMessage to indicate that this came from a real Apple device versus not coming from an Apple device. I don't know, but that seems to me like a major problem just waiting around the corner.
Yeah, I sort of wonder if right there, I don't necessarily want to name names. Of there's a famous Android app that promises you iMessage access that seems to do it in a very sketch way, and and that type of thing is, it is scary, and it's definitely something that is yucky. It needs to be addressed. So at least the good thing about the Apple ecosystem, right, is they tend to have broad adoption of updates in a way that Android devices never do. So if it's possible to fix something in software, certainly seems to be a greater chance that it'll be pushed to more Apple devices than Android devices. But is that a perfect solution? No, but I think at least it could be worse.
Yeah, I think this comes right back to the concept of multimodality, right? When you have AI agents that honestly you can run locally now. I mean, the language models are getting so good, you can run them on a modern graphics card with enough memory. So the bad guys just have to rent some machines that have graphics cards on them. They can run these models locally. Nobody can ever see what they're doing. The models don't have to be aligned, right? I mean, it's just kind of chaos around the corner. I'm certainly on the lookout for what's next in solving those problems. Anyways, moving on. So we've talked about Google and Yahoo's new requirements. You've talked about DMARC a fair bit. There's a new version of DMARC coming out at some point in the near future. DMARC BIS is the name that's floating around on mailing lists. I wondered if you could comment on any of the improvements in DMARC that are coming down the pipe.
That is a little bit of a gap in my knowledge, that I have some theories and some suspicions that I will sound stupid if I talk about them just yet, unfortunately.
That's fine.
So that might be one of those things that we might want to skip over, unfortunately. If it was a couple months later, I know we talked a lot. What's the way to frame a good answer there? I'm pause for a sec. There's been a lot of talk about what are the potential pitfalls or limitations of DMARC. If you look at, for example, it doesn't do anything about like DKIM replay attacks. How do you do something where what can you do to rev authentication in a way that's going to help make email more secure than it is now? You've also got issues with SPF, where a number of providers do extremely broad includes that are relatively easy to exploit if you get on the same platform of them. We've talked about stuff like this before. I know you're aware of challenges around all of that. So I'm hopeful that there are going to be an evolution. There is going to be an evolution of the specs that make it easier to apply some of this stuff. What is most interesting to me, for example, is what is the right way to police and potentially prevent or mitigate DKIM replay attacks. I think that is a new exploitable frontier that's significantly problematic and is something we never thought of when we talked about what we were going to do with DKIM back in the day. We just never conceived of the fact that if we divorce the authentication from the sending platform, from the sending machine, that anybody could take a message and resend it. And what's the side effect of that? And somebody could put their content in a good message, send it through a Gmail or Yahoo or some webmail provider, or hack into an account on some ESP or CRM platform, send one message out, and then use a botnet to replay that message, 3 million times. It's going to annoy people. It's going to damage reputation. It's going to be tremendously difficult to catch, because when you're looking at the stuff now in, for example, a DMARC dashboard, suddenly you see traffic that says it's you and it's passing authentication, but doesn't seem to be coming from your infrastructure at all. Very, very confusing and bad. So for me, that's the focus on where I think the specifications around for SPF, DKIM, and DMARC need to go. Beyond that, I haven't really delved deeper into what other people think are good ideas. And that's always the challenge, because there's a reason I haven't done that. It's because people want to argue endlessly about how DKIM was not made to do this. DMARC was not meant to do this. Well, stuff evolves, and it has to evolve.
What I pay attention to is whenever the people from Google talk about DMARC on the mailing list, that's like, okay, they are speaking in an official capacity about Google's perspective on DMARC and what the new standard should have in it. One of the things that Google has said on the DMARC mailing list is that they would like to see the ability to allow domain owners to specify their preferences around whether SPF will be used to authenticate their domain. So a common problem that you've identified is that if you use a large email sending service and you authorize that service through an SPF include, you're giving a lot of people the opportunity to send mail from your domain, and you're trusting that platform to somehow police the use of your domain. Not all platforms do that well, and some don't do it for good reasons because they can't. So in that situation, if DMARC had a way to specify, look, I want you to use DKIM for my domain, but if I have an SPF record, don't treat that as significantly. Just passing SPF might not mean you should trust this message from my domain. You don't want to get rid of SPF because, as you said, it's useful to be able to identify the infrastructure that your messages are coming from. You want to be able to tell the internet, this is generally my infrastructure. If you get stuff from somewhere else, you should definitely reject it, right? You want to be able to say that, but at the same time, you don't want it to sort of have the same significance as a cryptographic signature that came from your infrastructure.
That's really where we need to go. And to your point, even if you trust the platform, anybody security savvy would much rather be able to set what their preferred security requirements on their own domain at their level. Then you don't have to worry about what the platform does. So we went through this when I worked for a rather large ESP with many thousands of customers, and the SPF include just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And you worry about the potential loopholes, even if you mean to do everything right at that platform level to prevent customer one from impersonating customer two. It is a complex problem, and anything that provides more tools to better secure that sort of cross abuse, or to prevent it wholly and bring that security control to the domain owner, that is a fantastic thing that needs to happen. Absolutely.
So we're coming to the end of our time together on the podcast today. I wanted to ask you towards the end of our conversation, what is your view about the future of email? What do you see coming in the next 5 years? What makes you excited, beyond Google and Yahoo's announcement about 2024? But what do you see coming in the next 5 years that makes you excited that email will continue to be a relevant medium for sending out marketing and other information to people on the internet?
There are little things like, Gmail annotations and ways to sort of improve what you can do inside of email messages that are kind of cool and kind of neat things for the future. I think whether or not email is going to be have something new and big and exciting coming over the hill, I'm not sure, but I am pretty confident that it is so well loved and so widely and broadly used, that it's going to continue to be a big deal. It's growing. It's not shrinking. People keep saying email is dead. Email is not dead. Even people keep saying email marketing is dead. Email marketing is not dead and is not going anywhere. The use cases have shifted a little, right? We talked before about, omni-channel marketing versus just straight email marketing, right? There's a lot of room for different ways to be able to contact people, whether it be push notifications, SMS, or, other ways to interact via apps or what have you. And so while some of that gets functionality is sort of peeled away from email and handed off to those other bits, those other ways of communicating, there's still going to be that core there. There's still going to be that connection to the person on the other end there, both for one-to-one communication and the right kind of, bulk communication, whether it be email marketing, whether it be password resets, registration codes, another form of two-factor. Certainly not the only one, not the best one out there, but you need to have multiple methods of identification. And so I still think there's going to be all this stuff that email is good for. What other all saying, all dancing thing is it going to do that I haven't thought of yet? I don't know, but I don't think it's going anywhere.
I think I feel the same way. Whenever someone predicts the death of email, for whatever reason, Twitter is going to kill email, the Fediverse is going to kill email, whatever, texting is going to kill email. I ask them, what will replace that universal identifier that goes onto your business card that you use to log into websites? How do you replace that thing, that address that lets anyone in the world get in touch with you? So if it's not going to be email, then what is it? What is as universal as email? If you want to replace it, you've got to make everybody use it, which seems like an absolutely impossible task. And although email has its faults, it is truly the only fully open way that you can reach someone on the internet. It continues to be that. I don't see anything changing that in the coming years.
Yeah, nobody owns email. And that's an important thing, that it is a cross-platform, cross-company communication method in ways that other platforms aren't, right? If you have an iPhone and you have iMessage and you have all your friends around iMessage, you can communicate with all them. But if you want to cross over that divide and talk to Android users, we all know what a pain in the butt that is, right? Apple finally said they're going to bring RCS support to iPhone sometime in the future. But you look at it was weird. The last 2 years, I worked for a company that was very Slack heavy. So almost all of their communication was done via Slack, and that's the company was sort of born into that. It was a very small startup that got sold into a bigger company. So people talk like, well, that's the future. Slack is going to replace email. And it didn't, it wasn't able to do so perfectly by any means, because you lose some of the ability to find history, to search, to organize in ways that, for example, that I can do in Gmail that I can't do in Slack, right? They both have search functions, they both have threading, but in different ways. And the ability to export, link, communicate, is so much different between those two tools that for people that just say email's dead, the whole company's just on Slack. Anybody above a certain, it's kind of like kids, right? Where they say, well, I only SMS, I don't use email anymore. Well, you're not in the right business environment for it. Maybe you don't need to be, but for everybody else, the rest of us that are actually communicating on how to get stuff done, that is done at the business level via email. It's funny because the second I left that company, was laid off last month, and I'm still a little peeved about that. But what did I do to engage all these people that I've been talking to since to find my next opportunity? To find job leads, to coordinate interviews. That is all coordinated via email. That's how I got my job. That's how I got my next job that I'm starting in January, is via email. That's email. That's a success story for me, for email right there.
Well, congratulations on finding your new job. We're all looking forward to finding out what it is. And it's been such a pleasure talking to you, Al. I've wanted to do this for a long time. And I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. Take care. Great to talk to you.